everyone, and good evening, and welcome to Is Hemophilia a Secret? Disclosure in a World Filled with Technology, part of the National Hemophilia Foundation's Hemophilia webinar series. This series is supported by an educational grant from Novo Nordisk. Our presenter this evening is Javed Dallas. He is a clinical social worker with the Oklahoma Center for Bleeding and Clotting Disorders in Oklahoma City. Javed has presented at various educational conferences nationally, including most recently at NHF's Inhibitor Education Summits. Welcome, Javed.
Thank you very much, Kelly.
You're welcome. Our program will conclude with a question and answer segment. To ask a question, go to the area in the far left of your webinar screen and type your question in the field just to the left of the send button, which is located in the pod or area labeled chat. Click the send button when you have finished typing your question. However, please note that your question will be addressed during the question and answer session. Actually, we're taking them throughout, so you can type them in at any time, and Javed will be addressing them as they do come in today. There are no handouts for this presentation. However, a recording of this webinar will be available shortly on the National Hemophilia Foundation website at hemophilia.org. And now I would like to turn things over to Javed.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I would like to thank everyone first and foremost for taking time out of their busy schedules for this webinar. I know that life gets hectic, and so I know sometimes just carving that little bit of time out to learn can be difficult. I want to thank the National Hemophilia Foundation for having this webinar series, and thank also Novo Nordisk. To kick things off, I would like to introduce myself. As Kelly said, my name is Javed Dallas. I'm a social worker at the Oklahoma Center for Bleeding and Clotting Disorders. I've been there approximately 4 years. I've been a presenter with the National Hemophilia Foundation for approximately 3 years, presenting on topics such as disclosure, 504 and school issues, advocacy, and other things like that. Now, as we go through the webinar series, this is a little bit different than how I'm used to presenting, and I'm sure probably a little bit different than you're used to receiving this information. But I do want this to be as interactive as possible. One of the things that I always say to my audience is that I don't consider myself to be an expert in the field, though I've been in the field for a while. I consider you all to be the experts in this, and that in part you live with this every day. So any questions that you have, any input that you have, go ahead and type that in to the chat function, and Kelly has been invited to go ahead and read those as they come in. So we've made it through that portion. Okay, now, when I speak about the bleeding disorder community, the image that I really like to paint is that of a literal community or of a neighborhood. The people who are on the call tonight, we've got quite a few of you on so far, and I'm sure that there will be others who join us as the night progresses. The people who are on tonight, the people in your treatment centers, the people that we see at the conferences that we go to, that we've attended camps with, those are the people that I like to think of as our neighbors. Part of the reason that I love this image is because, like most of our neighbors, we probably don't interact with them every day. But like any good neighbor, you know, if we need anything, the bleeding disorder community, I've seen time and again, has always been there to support each other. Now, there are a couple of things that as we go through that I want for us to hope to be able to pull out. The first thing is for us to be able to talk about the dynamics and the ramifications of being able to disclose hemophilia in a variety of circumstances and situations. The second is being able to explain the potential pros and the cons associated with sharing information in the digital age. Now, one of the challenges in dealing with disclosure is that it's different for most everybody who deals with a bleeding disorder. For some people, they're very little affected by their bleeds and by their pain, and they may not think much of it. While we know, most of us know other people who are sidelined for days and for weeks at a time, managing their bleeds, managing their pain, and so for them, it may be a little bit more difficult to not deal with the issue of disclosure. And there are a few different areas that I want to touch on as we talk about this issue of disclosure. The first is work. Now, when we talk about employment, there are really two primary laws that provide protection. The first is Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The second is the Family Medical Leave Act, or commonly known as FMLA. Now, one may ask the question, does this apply to me? When we talk about the Americans with Disabilities Act, it really comes down to three questions, and you really have to meet the qualifications for all three in order to be protected. The first question that you have to ask yourself is, do you have a disability but otherwise qualify for the job? If that's the case, then we can move on to the next question, which is there a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity? And then the third is, do you have a record of, or have a history of having a substantial impairment, and substantial as opposed to minor impairment? So if you meet these three qualifications, then you are afforded protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act. As we go through these slides, I know that there may be questions regarding specific situations. We may not necessarily be able to get to all of those situations in the question and answer period. But one of the things that I strongly believe in, there's a saying that says, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day. But if you teach him how to fish, he eats forever. And so to that end, I really want to not only be able to talk about this and answer specific questions for you all tonight, but I also want to be able to provide the information for you all so that you're able to apply this to specific situations, and also able to share this information with your community, wherever it is that you live, and with the people that you interact with. I think it's important in part because if you don't know what your rights are, it's easy for someone to take them away from you. But then the second piece is it allows you to be able to not only disclose, as we talk about this issue of disclosure, but it also allows you to begin to advocate or to speak up for what your rights are and the things that you need. So we may not get to all of the questions, but I do encourage you to, after this is over with, or as we go through this, take notes on the Americans with Disabilities Act, take notes on FMLA, to see if there are, as you run into difficulties, to see if there are protections that you might be able to get through these laws. So we talked about the three prongs or the three qualifications to be afforded protections under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, one of the things that the Americans with Disabilities Act provides is what are known as reasonable accommodations. So some of these accommodations may include providing or modifying equipment or devices for you to be able to do the job successfully. One of the other things may be job restructuring. Part of that may be changing the layout of the job, moving where the office is such that someone with a disability with reasonable changes can have access to that job. It may also include adjusting or modifying examination or training materials or policies, or making the workplace readily accessible to and usable by people with disabilities. And part of this is to be able to provide access, equal access to employment for those people who are otherwise qualified for those jobs, so that access to the job itself isn't a reason for discrimination against someone with a disability. One of the other important things that's clearly stated in the Americans with Disabilities Act is that an employer may not ask under any circumstances if you are disabled, but they are able to ask if you can perform the job with or without reasonable accommodation. One of the questions that's often asked as I travel is, are you required to disclose? Are you required to disclose in the interview or during the application process, or as you're applying for insurance, that you have a disability? And the answer to that also is no. You're not required to disclose, but one of the things that I do point out is that if you don't disclose your disability, then you are not entitled to the protections that disclosure provides. Now, the other law that I mentioned is the Family Medical Leave Act of 1993. And this applies to any employer who employs 50 or more people within a 100-mile radius of your local work site. And what it provides is it provides certain employees up to 12 work weeks of unpaid job-protected leave each year, and requires group health benefits to be continued during the leave as if the employee continued to work there instead of taking the leave. Now, the other things that many employers also allows is if there is paid time off or sick leave, they also may allow you to access this. Instead of being unpaid, it would allow you to draw off of the leave that you have banked up. Now, one of the questions that I think, that we will wrestle with tonight, or that I'll continue to mention, is to share and not to share. That being the question, thinking about the pros and the cons. I don't think that there is a one-size-fits-all for that. But as we go through each of the slides, as we think about the laws, as I bring up different topics to think about, getting each one of you to think about that and how it applies to your own relationships with your employer. Think on your own relationships with your loved ones, your relationships with your friends and the people that you hang out with. As we talk about the pros, one of the pros as we talk about employment is that in disclosing or being able to talk about the disability that you have, number one, it affords you protections. The second thing, and we'll say this with each one of the modules, is that in disclosing, it allows you to have a conversation with other people who may not have encountered anyone with a bleeding disorder. And I think that as we think about the encounters that we have had historically with other people, that there are a lot of misconceptions out there related to hemophilia and related to von Willebrand and related to other bleeding disorders. And so I think by disclosing, it allows us to have a conversation and shed light and share the knowledge that we have about how we've been able to manage the bleeding disorders that we do manage, or the disabilities that we manage. Now, the cons may be, I know for some people, they're afraid of the stigmas that are attached to them, that for some people the knowledge may not be enough, that they may be afraid of the discrimination that comes with disclosing to an employer in terms of being treated differently or being passed over for raises or promotions. But going back to the importance of knowing the laws is that the law does protect you if you have a disability. It protects you when it comes to promotion. It protects you when it comes to raises. It protects you when it comes to employment practices and training. And so by having the information related to the Americans with Disabilities Act, by having information related to the Family Medical Leave Act, it allows you to not only disclose, but also I think the flip side of disclosure is advocacy, and it allows you to advocate for your rights. It allows you to advocate for your needs, and it allows you to advocate for other people who will come into that situation, and to be able to share knowledge as well. Now let's take some time and see, are there any questions before we move on out of the work segment of disclosure? Does anyone have any questions about disclosing to an employer?
Okay, I'll give them a reminder on how they can ask questions. You could go down to the chat pod located in the lower left corner of your screen and type and send your question. Also, too, if you would like to ask a question live and you're on the telephone, you can do so by pressing *1 on your telephone keypad. I will announce each caller prior to bringing you into the conference. And please remember, if you have your phone on mute, take it off mute when you are selected to ask your question. All right, looks like we do have a question that has come in from Danielle. She wants to know existing condition in regards to insurance.
All right, Danielle, I think that that's a great question. I think that that's something that for a lot of people who deal with disabilities, as it relates to disclosure, that's really one of the big questions they have, is how it relates to disclosing a pre-existing condition. The protection that's afforded for pre-existing conditions is the ACA. I'm sorry, or also known as Obamacare, and so it prevents insurers from discriminating or charging more to anyone who has a pre-existing condition, and it also does not allow them to discriminate or to deny coverage to anyone with a pre-existing condition. Danielle, if you'll just answer, type in yes or no and let me know if that answered your question.
All right, let's check.
Okay, so Danielle said correct, but what about the ACHA we just passed in the House? Okay, good. So we're paying attention to the news. So like I said, the first piece I think is disclosure. The second side I think is advocacy. So the ACHA has passed in the House. As it stands right now, it looks like the Senate will probably do some rewrites. So that's one of those things that unfortunately I would have to say is up in the air. The other piece of that is I encourage everyone to call their local congressman. I tell people every day, I can't tell you which way to vote, but every one of us has a voice, and it's important that we use the voice that we have, because whether we voted for our representative or not, they represent all of us and not only a portion of us. So it hasn't passed the Senate yet, but right now we don't know what it may look like in its final version.
All right, we have another question that has come in. That question is from Edgar, and he would like to know what happens if it is disclosed after you are hired.
Well, I think Edgar, as it applies to after we're hired, once again, we're still protected. There are two laws. There are two primary laws that protect us. Number one being the Americans with Disabilities Act, and the second being FMLA. If we meet the criteria of as the law is applied, so we still can't be discriminated against as it relates to any sort of promotion or advancement, being paid more, and those sorts of things. So there's no discrimination that an employer can do even after one is hired. If an employer happens to move into a new building, if you've already disclosed, then the Americans with Disabilities Act still provides you the protection that they have to make sure that the place is accessible to you. Now there are quite a few different ways that reasonable accommodations can be applied after we're hired, and so sometimes sometimes one has to get into the specifics of what is the need that one has, and what is the barrier in order to be able to meet that need in a reasonable way.
Okay. Next question is from Sarah. If you are open about disclosing your bleeding disorder, how early in the job interview process is it okay to reveal this information? Oh, it looks like we've lost Javal. Just one moment while I'm sure he's probably dialing back in. So ladies and gentlemen, just bear with us for one moment while we get him back. Okay, just one moment.
Kelly?
Oh, there you are. Welcome back.
Thank you. Is everyone else there?
We are, yes.
Okay, I am not sure what happened. Okay, so Sarah's question was, if you're open about disclosing your bleeding disorder, how early in the job process is it okay to reveal this information, or how early is too early? Sarah, I don't know that there's necessarily a right or wrong answer. I think that, one of the things that I stated, and I'll probably continue to state, is I think that every situation is a little bit different, in part because everyone has a different level of comfort with their bleeding disorder. And so the information that they have about it and that they're able to share about it with other people may be a little bit different. I think also the job structure, that there are some jobs and there are some job structures where, there are very rigid circumstances, and so one may not feel as comfortable disclosing that information. And then sometimes we get into situations, we get into interviews, and there's a vibe about who we get into the situation with. And there may be a level of comfort that's there that creates such that we feel able to share more than we would have necessarily shared with a different interviewer, even if it's the same corporation. Does that answer your question, Sarah?
Yes, she says thank you, and yep, and it looks like we have no further questions, so I'll turn it back to you.
Okay. So the next portion that I want to talk about is romance. And I also put more than friends, because I realize that generationally there is this divide that seems to exist between dating and, as the next generation calls it, Netflix and chill. So I think some people may not consider themselves to be in a romantic position, and so may not necessarily feel like this applies to them, but I do want people to think about, even if they're in this Netflix and chill or just hanging out situation, if things do become intimate, just thinking about the outcomes and consequences associated with that. Now, to that end, I do like there's a saying that I have, which is on the screen, of course, that says, "No man is an island entire unto himself, but all of us are every man a piece of the continent." And this is that for all of us, whether we like it or not, that at some point we'll have to wrestle with, whether with love and how we share the information that's close to us as it relates to disclosure. So in thinking about this romance or this friendship, or a little bit more than friends, the first thing that I like people to think about are qualities that you want in what we would consider to be a healthy relationship. I don't think that there is a such thing as a perfect relationship, or going back to the image that I was painting earlier of community, I don't think that there is a perfect one of those, but I do think it's important that as we think about, what are the qualities that create healthy relationships? What is it that you want, and what is it that you're willing to give? So what I've done is I've jotted a couple of them down. I think that one of the first things that most people would say is that they want respect. They want to be respected, respected about who they are. For those people who are dealing with disabilities, bleeding disorders, being able to be respected for both our strengths and our weaknesses. I think most of us would like to have some sort of honest relationship. as we enter into romance or more than friends or however we want to couch that situation, that most of us want some level of acceptance just for us to be able to be who we are. I don't have to be anything more. I don't have to be anything less. I want to be more than I am today, but knowing that the person that I'm looking at accepts me for who I am, all my baggage and everything that I come with. I think most of us would want trust. We want to be able to trust the person that we're with. You know, nobody would, I don't think that there's anyone who would say that they want someone that they just cannot trust. I think all of us know somebody in relationships like that, whether we like it or not, but we wouldn't necessarily consider that to be a healthy relationship. And then the other one, I think, is what I consider mutual aid or helping one another. You know, there's a song that I talk about at some of the seminars that I go to, that the song Lean on Me. And it talks about the fact that at some point all of us are going to need somebody to lean on. And if we're in a relationship, a healthy relationship, that's one of the things that we're going to want. Now, as we think about, you know, how to share and when to share, I think some of the questions are going to be the same, whether we're talking about work, whether we're talking about romance, whether we're talking about online or, you know, interacting with people in the internet. But I think that there's an intimacy that's there when we talk about romance, because in part because we open ourselves up in ways to be exposed or to be hurt or to be encouraged in romantic relationships. And so I kind of want to open, well, not kind of, I want to go ahead and open this up again to questions, to, you know, to things that you wrestle with, because I think we've got approximately 20 people on the line. And so generally there's a variety of ages that are represented. Generally there are a variety of viewpoints that are represented. And so I think that this in part allows us, each one of us, to share and to impart knowledge, to get other people to think about, to grow the community. So go ahead and throw your questions out there, throw your thoughts out there. You know, how do you wrestle with the question of when to date? If you would rather your name not be said as it relates to this question, start out with that in all bold letters, and we'll keep your name secret. But I do want to encourage you all to share your thoughts, because all of us, if you stayed on the phone this long, you've been interested or provoked by something that's on here. So go ahead and throw whatever questions that you have out. Like I said, if you don't want your name said, put it in all capital letters. But how do you wrestle with that question of how to disclose to someone else or when to disclose to someone else? And I guess another question would be, do you disclose to someone if you're not interested in them in a romantic way yet, but you're just dating them? Just someone that you're seeing.
Okay. Looks just a reminder to the audience, you can go to the chat pod and type in your question in the bottom and then hit send. Also, you can ask a question live if you're on the telephone by pressing *1. Michelle made a comment in regards to the last topic for the workforce. She said that she would not disclose anything ahead of time. Now, I don't know if that includes romance or not, but...
Well, Michelle typed that in when we were talking about the workplace.
Right.
And that was around the time that I got caught off the phone, so I do apologize, Michelle, and thank you for your comment. And I do know that there are many people, kind of just piggybacking off Michelle's comment while hopefully people are typing in, that there are lots of people who do choose not to disclose. I was at a conference this past weekend, and there was a gentleman who said that in all of his years of working at his job, and I think he said he'd been there 15 years, that he's never disclosed, that he, you know, the bleeds that he has, he's been able to manage the minor ones. And the major ones, fortunately, have happened to come while he was either on the weekend or vacation. And so I know there are many people who never choose to disclose to their employer, just like Michelle stated.
Okay. The next question, is there such a thing as disclosing too early in a relationship?
I think part of that can be, and I underline that word, can be, too personal. I think probably the only absolute way that would be too early is if one introduced themselves in such a way that it was like, hi, my name is Javay Dallas and I've got hemophilia. You know, then it's like, wow, that might be too much information. You know, but there are probably a lot of other things that we could couch right there as it relates to their things that people tell us too early in a relationship. But I think part of it may be, I think part of it is knowledge. I think part of it continues to be knowledge, you know, and how we're able to have that conversation about a bleeding disorder. But I think that there are some people who may never be able to appropriately have that conversation, and I say that on the receiving end, not as someone who has the bleeding disorder, but that there are some people who may never be able to, who are never mature enough to deal with someone who has a bleeding disorder. And so it doesn't matter whether we're talking 6 weeks into the relationship or 6 years into the relationship and dealing with that, they may never be able to handle, you know, or mature enough to manage that relationship.
All right, looks like we don't have any further. Oh, wait a minute, look at that. All right, next one. I have always been open with all my relationships living with my bleeding disorders. I have found that it has made it easier when bleeding episodes happen. Everyone has an idea or plan of what they can do to help me.
And I really do think that that's a great comment. Because as I was talking about wrestling with, you know, encouraging you all to wrestle with this question of disclosure, and the flip side being advocacy, is that, you know, that there are lots of people that we hang out with, our friends and buddies, and just getting people to think about, getting those with bleeding disorders to think about what happens in the worst case scenario. And so I do think, if one is comfortable with their bleeding disorder, that it does allow to be able to plan, in the event I have a bleed, this is exactly what needs to happen. This is where my medicine is. This is, my hematologist. This is, and being able to appropriately relay the information that's necessary.
All right.
So
sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay, the next comment we have, she says that her husband has VWD, but
which is von Willebrand disease.
Okay, and wasn't diagnosed until after our children were 5 years old. We just didn't know much about the family history of VWD, so we haven't been through this situation yet. We have twin girls who are 12, and they've been very open about their VWD with their friends. I hope that as they move into more romantic stage, they will continue to be open enough about it, so this acceptance is part of their relationship from the beginning.
And this comment is very, at least, I'll speak to the first part first in terms of, one getting older and finding out that there's some sort of family history of the bleeding disorder. That people I think we live in a day and age where we're able to be more open about each one of us about the situations in which we live. And so finding out that, perhaps that some of the issues that we live with may have some sort of genetic component to it, allows us to, I think, have intergenerational conversations, which is the second part of what the commenter said, in terms of being able to have conversations with her daughters, and then also her daughters being able to share that information with their friends. And I think in part it helps to dispel a lot of the myths that people had about bleeding disorders for so long, that created a lot of the barriers themselves. Now, as it relates to the romantic relationships, I certainly agree with you, and I hope that your daughters continue to feel comfortable with their bleeding disorders, And, you know, I would encourage you, if they're not involved in camps, if they're not involved in the local chapter and things like that, I think that those things continue to instill confidence in them, because in part they're around other people who are able to manage those bleeding disorders and transition into successful romantic relationships and successful employment opportunities, and the other things that come with that.
All right. Next comment is, in terms of disclosure, something interesting. I have a bleeding disorder, actually opposite of hemophilia, a clotting disorder, and even working for a hemophilia organization. I feel they do not understand, for example, when my blood gets too thin from my blood thinners and I can't go to work. Interesting, since I actually work for a hemophilia organization.
That is interesting, I think, is one word that we can use for it. One of the things that I would encourage you to do, and I think that this, you know, kind of goes back to some of that what I've continued to talk about, is using that word advocacy. Advocating doesn't always have to be loud, but continuing to have conversations. They say it's the squeaky wheel that gets the grease. So continue to educate yourself about your bleeding disorder, and the more information that you have, the more information that you're able to share with others and to shed light, even though sometimes we think we know what we know, that we may not actually hold the truth. And so I think that that allows you an opportunity, you know, in part to provoke the community to think about, you know, the other side of that. And so I would continue to just, you know, continue to encourage you to speak up about your bleeding disorder, just like I encourage everyone else to. And that's regardless of where it is that we work.
All right, and the next comment, I don't think it has the same stigma as 30 years ago. People are more open.
And she's very right about that. The comment is very right about that. I think, you know, in part, that we're able to better manage. We know more about medicine now than we did 30 years ago. We know more about, you know, the blood itself and the body itself than we did 30 years ago. And when I say we, I don't mean necessarily just the bleeding disorder community, but I think, you know, as a nation and as the world, there's just a body of knowledge has continued to grow over the years, and which is one of the reasons that I continue to promote, you know, the importance of education. That applies, I think, on all levels, that, you know, so that we can continue to dispel stereotypes, we can continue to knock down walls and the barriers that exist.
All right, and it looks like we have no further comments or questions, so I will turn it back to you, Jabe.
All righty. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the internet. And one of the reasons that I put this slide, I think a lot of the ways that we connect and disclose are in part the same as you'll see when we move on. But, you know, the truth is, like it or not, we live in a society where it's really impossible for us not to interact with the internet, it seems like, on a daily lives. For younger people, the internet and computers have been almost a part of our lives as much as our hands and our feet. With computers and phones in all of our homes, it seems like it's inescapable. And the internet does offer new frontiers for us. It allows us to create and to recreate ourselves time and again. It allows us to discover and to be discovered. But like all new territories, all the dangers have yet to be fully thought out or predicted. And so as we talk about the internet, I think that there are really a few main platforms. There are a few main platforms that I really want you to think about. And I think that, you know, in these main platforms, there's a lot of information that's fed from those. The first is Facebook, of course. The second is Twitter, and then the third is Instagram/Snapchat. And I have these bulleted out in terms of disclosure. This is the one where I like people to think about the fact that we've talked a lot about in work. Do I tell my employer that I have a bleeding disorder? Do I not tell them? As it relates to romance, do I tell this person that I'm attempting to get to know, or do I not tell them that I'm managing a bleeding disorder? But when it comes to online, one of the things that I found is this is the place where most people have given away control without even necessarily thinking about giving away control. And you may ask the question, how have I done that? But if you think about if you get on Facebook and you're looking at someone's profile, how do you tell the things that they're interested in? In part, we tell by the groups that they follow, by the likes that they've given. We follow by the hashtags. Same for Twitter, same for Instagram, same for Snapchat, which is why I have each one of those couched up there. And so, even though we haven't made a conscious choice to disclose that we have an association or that we're managing a bleeding disorder, because of the mentions, because of the groups, because of the likes or the follows and the hashtags, we've inadvertently given people that information. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I do encourage people to think about the consequences or the outcome when their employer or their teacher or that romantic interest makes the choice to search for you through social media. So even though you have not consciously had that conversation with them, you've unconsciously still provided information to them that you may not necessarily have been ready for them to have. And so the question, or it was thrown out that being on social media is a conscious choice itself. And you're correct about that. But there are lots of things that people do through social media that they may not necessarily want all of their groups to know about. And so as we talk about the pros and cons of disclosure, getting people to think about not necessarily whether to get on social media or not, but getting them to think about, and we'll talk about this a little bit further in the next segment, techniques for how to appropriately disclose the bleeding disorder that they're dealing with, or whatever information it is that they've decided to post. So Michelle started out the question and answer period, and as I said, we'll come back to this question of to share or not to share. So we've talked about it as it relates to employers. We've talked about it as it relates to romantic relationships. As it relates to social media, do you all choose to engage in conversations or groups or follows related to your bleeding disorder, or is it something that you keep totally off of line? Because I find in part younger people seem not to necessarily engage related to their bleeding disorders online as much as say parents and grandparents advocating for walks and for their chapters and for national events. So as young people, how do you wrestle with that question of not necessarily whether we get online or not, but what information we choose to share and how we choose and to whom we share it with?
All right, and Danielle says, no, absolutely not. It's offline. I keep all social media generic or family related. I do not reveal any personal information about myself or my family.
Okay. And one of the things that I do encourage parents to think about as it relates to the social media and disclosure is posting your children. That, like we talked, that once we put the information on there, it's impossible for it to be totally erased. And so as parents, some parents choose to disclose their child's bleeding disorder that the child may not necessarily want at a future point for everyone to know about. Just a point for thought.
And Sarah's added, as a parent.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry. Go keep reading, Kelly.
Yeah, she's been sharing a lot on Facebook, and now she's worried that this will come back to haunt her kids.
I apologize, Sarah. I hadn't read your comment before I made that comment. It's really just something that I find, like I said, I've worked in a hemophilia treatment center. I go to camps with kids, and I've had the opportunity to go across the country and talk both with parents and with teenagers. And so that's really been one of the conversations that I've heard a lot. And like I said, I don't think that there's necessarily a right or a wrong answer. I think it's just food for thought, for parents, for siblings, for individuals who are managing their bleeding disorders. Just, something to think about in terms of not necessarily whether we do it, but how we do it and how we can do those things in a safe way. And Sarah's forgiven me for everyone who may wonder.
We have a comment for that parent. You can always pull things offline. Always. It may still be out there, but you can clean up your account. That may prevent employers or new people from seeing your personal information.
And you're right about that part. You can clean accounts up and things like that. Most employers aren't going to take the time to do a deep search. As I say, a lot of this is just kind of food for thought. But I think that there really are safe ways of disclosing to an employer. I think there are safe ways of disclosing to romantic partners. I think that there are safe ways of being able to share and to disclose online. I think that there are safe ways to be able to engage in groups. We're able to have this webinar. There are lots of other webinar series that are sponsored by and through NHF that allow those who are in the bleeding disorder community to provide advocacy, to provide information, support, and knowledge. And so I think that there are ways that one can do that in a safe manner.
All right, next comment. What I found, it helps to connect with other members of the bleeding disorder, other members of a bleeding disorder. So when I am facing a challenge that I have never faced, I have a quick support group to lean on. This has been a great support network and have met many lifelong friends at NHF's national meeting off Facebook groups.
And he's very right about that. That's one of the reasons, and I think he illuminates one of the reasons that I like to use the word community or neighborhood as I talk about the bleeding disorder community, is the support that's there, whether we're long distance or whether we're local. If you haven't had opportunities to attend, NHF events or chapter events, I certainly encourage you to do so. It provides great resources and a great support for those people who may be needing it. One of the things with bleeding disorders is that, there generally aren't very many people who live around us who are managing the same disability that we are. And so I think it's important that we know where we can get the support that we need when we need it.
Okay, and Samantha agrees. She said great support, and there is great support out there.
And so, that really does, I think, move us, if there are no more comments, and it looks like there aren't, into the last section, which is, what are some techniques for navigating disclosures? The first, I think, as I've continued to talk about, is educating yourself. The first thing to educate yourself about is your bleeding disorder. It's difficult to have a conversation with someone else about the things we're managing if it's hard for us to have that conversation with them. Or if we don't have the information that we can share in a way that we understand it, to be able to give it to them in a way that they can understand it also. So the first thing that I encourage people to do is educate yourself about your bleeding disorder. The next people is to educate yourself about your rights. When you know what your rights are, it allows you to draw lines in the sand regarding, the protections that you're afforded and being able to stand up and to demand those protections in an appropriate way. The next thing is, with every right comes a responsibility. So know what your responsibilities are. What are the things that are required from you, not only from the Americans with Disabilities Act or FMLA, but one of the things it requires is that you are qualified for the job. And so making sure that you live up to each responsibility so that you can continue to be given the protection that you need. Another technique I think is important for navigating disclosures is checking your security settings online. As we were talking about the online Facebook and Snapchat, Twitter, Instagram, one of the things that I continue to say is I'm not anti-social media or any of those things, but I think that, being able to just really be aware of the information that we share. And most of those do provide some level of security in terms of being able to direct certain information to certain groups and allowing certain people access to certain information. So make sure that you check your security settings. Check the security settings of your children if you have children, to make sure that you're comfortable with the information that they're sharing as well. One of the most important things is connect with others. We talked about this in the last session, or the last section rather, is connect with others at chapter events. Go to national events. If you haven't been to NHF, National Hemophilia Foundation events, get involved there. There are online groups. Like we said, they're not necessarily all bad, but make sure that you get good information and make sure that you check your security settings. One of the things about online groups, though, getting you to think about is you don't necessarily know who it is that's on the other end. As we talked about, it allows you to create yourself and recreate yourself. I don't know how many emails I've gotten from my uncle in Nigeria who promises me a lot of money if I would just give him a little bit of money. But my mom keeps telling me that that's not my uncle, so I don't send him any money. And so, similarly, you don't know who's on the other end of that email or that online group as well. So that's really just one of the things to think about as it relates to the online groups. And lastly, is advocate. Advocate for your cause, advocate for your child, advocate for your community. As we get the information, it's important that we share this information. One of the things that I share many times across the country is we shouldn't be bothered by or fearful of those who are ignorant of bleeding disorders. We who know have a responsibility to educate those who don't know. Then the world will be wiser. And so I think we're going to open it up for, okay, so there is a question. Kelly, do you want to start at Danielle's comment at 1950?
Sure, no problem. Let me see here. So Danielle says social media groups can be a great way to share information and connect with others. I'm not anti-social media. It's a fabulous tool. I think groups are safer than just posting to personal accounts.
100% agree. And as I talked about, I think that really just a lot of this is getting you to think about the information that we share and what are safe ways of being able to share that information.
Okay, and our next comments from Ashley. Tips, tools, and advice on how parents can help explain their child's bleeding disorder to them in a way that is understandable and doesn't induce fear. And at what age is it appropriate for them to become their own self-advocates?
I think that that's a great question. As I work with kids with bleeding disorders, I always try to, or actually as I work with kids, period, I've done counseling as well. I try to think about, on an age-appropriate level, what are things that the kids are used to. So when I talk with younger kids and we talk about bleeding disorders, one of the ways that I describe that is in terms of stickers. What child doesn't love stickers? And so I frame it in such a way that when we talk about blood clots, for someone who's not managing a bleeding disorder, their blood clots appropriately so they have the sticky on the back of the sticker. So those people who are managing bleeding disorders have kind of lost some of the sticky on their sticker. And so it's hard for the sticker to stick, just like it's hard for a clot to stick in trying to form a blood clot. As children get older, they're able to handle information a little bit differently, in a little bit of a more mature way. I think the most important thing as a parent explains the bleeding disorder to a young person is I find that kids are a little bit more resilient and they understand a little bit more than we may give them credit for at times. And so if the parent isn't freaking out about talking about the bleeding disorder, I find that generally the child is able to have a conversation about the bleeding disorder and ask questions. I think a great tool also, Ashley, is to get in touch with your local hemophilia treatment center when they go in for their next comprehensive clinic visit and allow them to talk to the nurse about their bleeding disorder and factor and some of the tools that are used. And I think it allows them to become comfortable with their bleeding disorder, and it doesn't induce the fear because it provides knowledge. And I think that many times we're fearful of the things that we don't understand. And so by providing that understanding, we can hopefully be able to manage some of the fears.
All right, thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, we only have a couple of more minutes left, so if you would like to submit a question, now is the time. Submit your questions in the chat pod in the lower left corner, or if you would like and you're on the phone, you can press *1 on your telephone keypad. I'll just give it a moment here. Here we go. Samantha, is there an ADA hotline you might recommend?
So one of the thing that I would do is if you will Google the words disability protections at work, one of the first sites that comes up is it's DOL.gov. DOL stands for the Department of Labor. And the Department of Labor provides the information related to the Americans with Disabilities Act.
All right.
And so it would provide the information directly related to the law itself. And like I said, that gives you the information that you need to be able to advocate. There's not a national ADA hotline. I would recommend you get in touch with your local EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. They are the local advocates for the Americans with Disabilities Act.
All right. That was our last question, and I would like to thank you, Javet. And ladies and gentlemen, your feedback is critical to us. Just one moment. There we go. Perfect. It loaded. Not only in evaluating this presentation, but in planning of future webinars. Please complete this 5-minute survey appearing on your screen now by clicking on the link. We would like to thank you all for attending, and this will conclude our program. Have a good evening.